Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Alyson Hanish and I'm delighted to be speaking with you today. I'm going to be giving you an overview of my amazing journey as a nurse, all the way through my initial interest in nursing to where I am now as a nurse scientist. So a little bit about me. I really first became interested in nursing as a career through actually a friend of mine in high school. Her mother was a pediatric nurse practitioner and she actually worked in the school system. And I was always so amazed by A, how happy she was with her job, but B, the scope of what she could do with her career. She was such a positive influence and a positive person, and that really started to get me engaged on nursing as a career path. I went in as a pre-nursing major at the University of Iowa after high school and ultimately graduated with a Bachelor of Science in Nursing in 2008. I had a wonderful experience there with a wonderful group of professors who truly turned me into the nurse I am today. During my time at the University of Iowa, I was involved in many research endeavors. One was a mentor of mine, who is still a mentor, who really got me interested in nurses' role in genetics. So she was a genetic nurse researcher by training, and that really sparked my interest and kept my interest throughout my career, really in genetics and pediatric conditions. So after graduating with my bachelor's degree, I started working on a pediatric inpatient unit at the University of Iowa hospitals and clinics. I had such a wonderful experience as being a nurse in that area, and I truly fell in love with our patients who had a diagnosis of cystic fibrosis. I was fascinated by this genetic condition and what research had done to improve the lives of these kids. This was a condition that many kids used to die from at birth, and through research and through scientists, we have come up with amazing management of this cystic fibrosis and treatments for cystic fibrosis that these kids are living well into adulthood and even having their own kids. So really through my experiences practicing as a nurse and working with those kids and working with their families, it really sparked my interest in how can I use research to improve the health of kids. About 6 months into working at the inpatient unit at the University of Iowa, I really could not shake the fact that I wanted to go back to graduate school. And I applied to the MSN to PhD programs, the Bachelor of Science in Nursing to a PhD. And at that time, they also allowed you to take courses to also be a pediatric nurse practitioner if you chose. And again, I mentioned at the beginning that was sort of what sparked my initial interest in nursing as a career. So I really, that was important to me to consider both the pediatric nurse practitioner role as well as a potential research role using the PhD. So again, went to the University of Iowa. I actually received a master's in science of nursing in 2011. At that time, my research was working with that same mentor that I had mentioned earlier who works in genetics, and she had this amazing grant opportunity to study what we call genomic incidental findings. And this is things that you find during a genetic test that you aren't necessarily expecting to find. So for instance, you're running a genetic panel on a child who may have a diagnosis of autism to look if there's potential genetic causes to the autism portion of the diagnosis. And in the interim, you find other genes, like say a gene that's involved in cancer, and what you do with that information. So those are what we'd be calling incidental findings, or things that weren't really what you were looking for, but you find this information. So through our research, we talked to lots of people, lots of public people, lots of scientists and clinicians, and sort of looked at the perspectives of people and what they thought about what we should do with this information, and also the logistics of this information, of how we documented this, how the information was or was not given to people. And that was a really amazing opportunity because it really showed how research and practice sort of come together to build better healthcare for people. So that was sort of my master's thesis or master's project that I did to receive a master's degree. Around that same time that I was wrapping that research up, I was afforded an opportunity through the National Institutes of Health, which is the major research funding organization here in the United States. And they offered me an opportunity to do my predoctoral training at the National Institutes of Health, which is located in Bethesda, Maryland. It's this really awesome place which they call intramural or inside NIH, where they actually have a hospital situated within scientists and scientists' labs. So sort of at the core, the center of this building, you have even inpatient units and outpatient units. And sort of at the peripheral ends of it, you have research labs where the actual scientists do their work. And it's amazing because we have people come from across the world to be part of research studies to improve their health. The lab that I was working in was largely pediatric endocrinologists, and they studied rare genetic disorders associated with pediatric obesity. And again, we had kids come from all across the world. These disorders were extremely rare. They were 1 in a million, so 1 in a million kids would be diagnosed with this disorder. And we would meet with them at this building in NIH, where they would basically receive assessments and care from various different healthcare disciplines. So nursing were involved, physicians were involved, physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists, all the way to dentistry and radiology. There were so many wonderful professions involved, psychology too. And I really started to love the role of nursing and the way we can see the larger picture across disciplines, organizing visits for these participants in the study, giving education and feedback to the participants in these studies, and ultimately being their advocate and being a scientist at the same time. So it was truly a wonderful predoctoral experience. I ultimately ended up studying that 1 in a million disorder, and what we found using brain MRIs were these kids were missing a pineal gland, which is a gland in your brain that produces melatonin that helps you sleep at night. So these kids were missing that pineal, had very low melatonin levels, and they were having some sleep problems. So again, this was an opportunity at NIH where I could work with this rare disorder and help to improve the care for those kids. So that's largely what I ended up doing my PhD in. So after a PhD, often people will go to extra training. And since I was in NIH intramurally, which is sort of outside of an academic setting, I decided to go back to academics because I love the idea of being able to teach the next generation of nurses. So I ended up taking a postdoctoral, what they call a fellowship or a training period for a couple years through the University of Nebraska Medical Center. I did the fellowship partly at this College of Nursing, which is where our nursing students are, as well as the Monroe-Meyer Institute for Genetics and Rehabilitation, which is an institute at the University of Nebraska Medical Center that largely works with kids who are diagnosed with some sort of neurodevelopmental disorder, which is also a wonderful opportunity for me. As I mentioned earlier, my initial spark and interest in nursing came from a pediatric nurse practitioner. When I was doing all of the research and these wonderful opportunities that were afforded to me, I was unable to actually do the pediatric nurse practitioner program just due to the time constraints. So I actually went back, and in 2019, so about a year ago, I graduated with a pediatric nurse from a pediatric nurse practitioner program. And I'm currently at the stage of trying to integrate this all. So integrating my knowledge as a nurse, integrating my my training as a nurse practitioner, so that practice piece, as well as the educational component, so training and teaching the next generation of nurses. What's really cool about nursing as a career is the abundance of opportunities you have, the ability to conduct research if you so choose, to practice as a nurse or a nurse practitioner, as well as be an educator. Those are all the wonderful options that you can have as a nurse, or like me, you can integrate all of them if your interest really lies in all. So I briefly mentioned my research involving that 1 in a million very rare genetic disorder, and I want to go a little bit into more detail here about that disorder so I can show you where I started in my research to where I currently am in my research. So that 1 in a million disorder, this PAX6 gene is involved, and genes make proteins that then help build things in the body, very simplistically. So the PAX6 gene here up top on A, and these are mice, is completely normal. And this PAX6 gene is involved in eye development. And you can see up there like a black portion and a gray portion of the eye. That gray portion is your iris, or the colored portion of your eye. So in kids who actually have PAX6 mutations, they are similar to what it looks like in B. So they have the eye structures, but they have the absence of the iris. That gray portion that's seen in A is not in B. So these kids are largely born, their eyes are completely black because they don't have the colored portion of their eye or the iris. That's more like what the kids would look like, more like B. C is actually what happens when you remove all PAX6 protein at all. So those mice do not have eyes at all. It is extremely rare that any child could actually live with a completely absent PAX6 gene or PAX6 protein. To date, I only know of one child who was born with this PAX6 mutation who only lived till 10 years of life. But that is the only known case I know of today. But this is sort of a gradient of what it looks like, of having a gene, how much of that gene is mutated, and how much protein is made lead to various degrees of eye development. So what I did for my research, what I ended up doing was looking in the literature to see, other than eye development, what other roles does this PAX6 gene play? And with those same mouse models that I showed you the slide prior, they also lacked certain brain structures. And one of those potentially was the pineal gland, a gland in the brain that produces melatonin, a hormone involved in circadian regulation. So a background to this was when I first met with my very first participant for this study, the mother sat down with us and we asked her what her most concerning thing was right now in terms of her child, in terms of this gene mutation that her child had. And one of the first things she told us was that my child does not sleep. And when my child doesn't sleep, I don't sleep, our family doesn't sleep, and it is a major issue for our family. At the same time as hearing this, I was a brand new mother, and my own child was a very, very poor sleeper. I felt like I internally understood partially her struggle and how much sleep impacted the family. So I began to look further into this literature, again knowing that PAX6 had some potential brain involvement, potential pineal involvement. So through this study, we actually had the opportunity to have brain MRIs on these kids with these diagnoses of what we call Wagner syndrome. And what we actually found through my research was there actually was a plausible biological explanation for the sleep problems these kids were having. It ended up being not just this one mother that I talked to. Subsequently, the majority of these patients and their parents had told us that sleep issues were major problems for their family. But back to the slides. Here is actually MRI data from my studies. So we have on the left what we would call a healthy control. Really, it's just a kid who didn't have Wagner syndrome. And you can see that structure where it's circled in red. There's a little outline. That is the pineal gland that produces melatonin that's involved in circadian regulation. If you look on that other side with that Wagner syndrome, that same structure is absent. This child did not have a pineal at all. Actually, through my research, what we found is that even though not all pineals are missing, all of these children had a smaller pineal. So if it wasn't absent, it was smaller. And what my research actually showed was that these kids with this diagnosis produce very little melatonin. We used actually urine and blood samples and compared them to kids without this syndrome, and they made very little melatonin. The parents used questionnaires, and they reported very high sleep disturbance and what we call sleep-related impairment, or how that sleep affects the person in the family. So largely my time at NIH was spent doing this, looking at biological mechanisms for sleep problems and these rare genetic disorders, talking to the parents and having them report what sleep was like to them. We also used actigraphs in these kids, which are basically really smart, like fitness tracker devices that tell you how much kids sleep. We also noticed that sleep patterns were different in these kids with this syndrome, which is plausibly related to the lack of melatonin that helps regulate your body's clocks and your sleep timing in your body. So that was largely my dissertation research, was working with this very rare genetic disorder. That research led to this scientific publication. So like I said, pineal hypoplasia, or a small pineal gland, reduced melatonin as well as sleep disturbance in these patients with this PAX6, we call haploinsufficiency, or this PAX6 gene mutation. In addition to the publication I just showed you of the pineal and melatonin related issues, we did wear those actigraphs, so those very smart fitness tracker devices. And in this publication, we actually found delayed onset of sleep in these kids with this PAX6 mutation, meaning it took them longer to fall asleep than other kids, which makes a lot of biological sense. If the melatonin levels are low, it does not drive them. That clock mechanisms don't drive them to want to go to sleep in the same way as other kids. So at this point of my career, I was working with, again, a very rare 1 in a million disorder of kids from all around the world. And I needed to decide where my next steps were as a nurse, where I thought I could make my biggest impact on kids, because this has always been my life's passion, is being a nurse, working with kids to improve their health. So what I actually did is spend a lot of time looking in our scientific literature to see where other pediatric or kid-related sleep problems were really highly prevalent, or where they happened a lot. And what I found was often kids with a neurodevelopmental disorder, such as autism or ADHD, those kids and the parents of those kids often report a lot of sleep problems. And those disorders are much more common. So autism and ADHD, I think, are both at near 1 in 60 kids right now. So nearly every elementary school is going to have a kid with one of those diagnoses in their classes. It's very, very common. So I decided to take a leap of faith, or that pivot with passion was just on the last slide, and really dive into sleep disorders in these kids who have a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. So what I found is that about 50 to 80% of parents report sleep problems in their kids with one of these diagnoses. And they really often, these parents report that it aggravates what we call their core symptoms. So like in kids with attention deficit disorder, ADHD, those kids become more hyperactive or more inattentive or not able to concentrate, worse when they don't sleep compared to when they have good sleep. So again, I took what I learned from a really wonderful opportunity at NIH, and I pivoted to another area where I could use my nursing science and my nursing role to really move to change healthcare. And with a lot of work and a little bit of luck, I ended up getting funded by the National Institutes of Health to do something that I am extremely passionate about, which is improving sleep in kids who have sleep problems. This right here is a spotlight that was on Facebook looking to recruit kids for a study I'm doing, which is actually a clinical trial to improve sleep in adolescents who are diagnosed with autism and or ADHD. As part of that clinical trial that I am conducting right now, we are looking at different sleep interventions to improve sleep in these kids. So one of those sleep interventions is melatonin, like the kind that you get over the counter here in the United States. And in this study, we're actually using a liquid version because some of these kids do not like to swallow pills. We're doing 3 milligrams that it's taken 30 minutes before they go to bedtime. So that's one of the sleep interventions. And we're actually comparing it to a brand new behavioral intervention that I have worked with a sleep psychologist to develop called the Bedtime Bank. And this is largely based on having adolescents have consistent bedtimes, or going to bed at a set goal time every single night, and holding kids accountable for that. So those are the 2 interventions very briefly. We use a clinical trial design to compare melatonin to a behavioral sleep intervention, aimed to improve sleep in these kids. I'd already sort of mentioned to you my background in melatonin, what your body makes of melatonin. And those kids with that rare genetic disorder, I again said they did not produce much melatonin, if any melatonin at all. That's also something I've continued into studying this additional group of kids, which are these kids with autism or ADHD. I'm actually using saliva samples and urine samples to measure their melatonin levels to see if they're potentially also low in melatonin, and to see if using melatonin over the counter, like the one I have pictured here, possibly if those kids respond better if they're low to having melatonin. Kind of like if you're low on a vitamin and you take a vitamin and it increases your body's levels of it. So we're looking into that. We're also measuring their biological levels of melatonin, which is something that I learned in my additional training prior to this. I know this slide might look a little bit complicated, but this is actually the study design for my clinical trial, which I love because I think it is such a nursing-centric type of design. This is based on largely how participants respond to a treatment option. So at that beginning square there on the left, we have our sample of adolescents who have a diagnosis of either autism and or ADHD. They are randomized to 2 interventions. One, that melatonin that I just mentioned, or the bedtime bank, that behavioral intervention. So basically half the sample goes to one, half the sample goes to the other, and they're randomized. If they respond, meaning that if I track with that smart fitness tracker that they're improving their total sleep time, they stay on that treatment option throughout the rest of the trial. The thing that's cool about these designs is that if those kids do not respond, meaning I'm not increasing their total sleep time sufficiently, they actually are re-randomized to another treatment option. So if I start those kids off on melatonin and they don't respond, and in some cases their sleep time might look worse for whatever reason, they get an option for another intervention. So they either get the bedtime bank or they stay on the melatonin and add the bedtime bank. What's awesome about this is it's very clinically oriented, that if somebody comes in with an issue and you work with them as a nurse or a nurse practitioner and it's not working, you switch to something else. At the right time, you make that call. So this sort of clinical trial design that I'm using is really new and up and coming, and it's a very smart, what they call it, design that is, I think, sort of in the future of what our designs are going to be looking like, how you adapt to how patients respond to treatment, which is very, very fun to work with. So basically, in summary, I had wonderful training opportunities through my bachelor's degree, master's degree, getting a doctoral degree or a PhD, going back to a pediatric nurse practitioner program to also become a pediatric nurse practitioner. My goal has always been to integrate them all. So what can I do as a nurse scientist to really move the science forward, to improve healthcare, and then bring that back to the practice part? So to move it beyond just the research and showing that there's sleep problems happen in these kids, that these interventions might work in a research side, but actually bringing them into practice and how we can implement the research in a practice setting. I love being able to have the opportunity to really integrate all of them together. This last slide here is really a summary slide. So it's saying that really exogenous, which means over-the-counter melatonin, has really shown promise in helping kids improve their sleep with minimal side effects. Our behavioral sleep interventions, they're really limited right now. So that's why we're developing this bedtime bank, which is that behavioral intervention, which we're actually working and turning into an app right now. So I kind of have transitioned to app development and tech development because this is a very new area that there's not a lot of interventions there for. So in addition to being a nurse and a nurse scientist, I get to be an innovator, which I think is awesome. It's a way to use creativity and really work your brain in ways that I wasn't really expecting. And in the end, further research and continuing funding, this is where this policy part comes in too, is necessary that we can support studies that improve sleep in these vulnerable kids who really need help with sleep interventions. Last but not least, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation today. I'm truly honored to be able to talk to you about nursing because as a career, I have had so many wonderful opportunities. Nursing has provided me with the ability to be creative and innovative and impactful and really to advocate largely for pediatrics in general, how we can improve healthcare for these kids and improve the lives of these kids and their families. Thanks again.